booktubers, it is that time of year again. It is the end of the year, and I am about to do my top 13 books of 2013. 2013 was a very interesting year for me. It's when I decided to branch out into a variety of different genres, including sci-fi and like graphic novels and stuff like that. So one of the books that I picked up solely based on a recommendation off of a friend was the Saga series, and I've read both volumes. I only own the first volume though. I don't own the second volume. I really enjoy this series, and I'm really happy that Priscilla from the Readables has decided to read this series because I think it is super fantastic. And I think in her video she said her comic book guy said it's a mixture of Star Wars and Romeo and Juliet, which I think is fairly accurate. So there are a lot of factors of this graphic novel that I adore. The artwork, the humor, the romance elements, though it's not completely in your face, and the inappropriateness of it. It's not inappropriate for the sake of being inappropriate. It just sort of works with the narrative, and I really enjoy it. I think this really sort of began a greater interest in reading graphic novels and comics and stuff like that, so I'm really glad that I picked this up, and yeah. That. Also this year I read John Fowles' The Collector, which is basically a psychological thriller type of book. It is more of a modern classic. I think it was published in the 1960s, and it's basically about a man who abducts a young girl and keeps her in his basement and tries to basically get her to fall in love with him. And the very interesting part of this book is that it sort of switches perspective. So in the first half of the book you get the perspective of the man, and then in the second half of the book it starts all the way back from the beginning, but in the perspective of the female character. And I very much enjoyed this book. It is just creepy and dark, and the writing is very well done. And I know this is not one of his more famous books, but this definitely sort of allowed me to take a little bit more interest in some of his other stuff, so yeah, that. So this year, A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness sort of came into my life, and this has got to be one of the most beautiful stories I've ever read. The artwork, the storyline, the characters, everything about it is just so haunting and tragic and just so perfectly well done. A lot of people have read this already on BookTube, and a lot of people feel the same way that I do, so it's kind of, yeah, it deserves a spot in this top 13 sort of list. But yeah, read it if you haven't, because it's just stunning. I also read this year The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, which is the first book in the series of 5 books. I haven't read the second book yet, but I very much intend to do so very soon. But this is sort of like a sci-fi book, but there's so much humor in it, and it's just really easy to read, and I really enjoyed it. I know a lot of people don't read it, but I'm slowly getting to really enjoy reading sci-fi, and I think this is a really great starter into the genre. So if you are thinking about reading sci-fi, but are a little bit afraid about getting into the whole sci-fi atmosphere, then try this one, because this is a really great one. Another sci-fi book that I just adored was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. I am super interested in reading a lot of his other stuff. I read a few of his short stories, but I haven't picked up any of his other books. It's just really great. There's a lot of action scenes in here. There's a lot of, you know, it plays with your mind, and I'm really interested to watch the movie, actually. So, yeah. Read this. It's really good. 1984 was another book that I decided to read this year that I sort of was like, I need to read this book, but I haven't read it. And I'm so glad that I did, because it was fantastic. Probably one of my favorites. I've read Animal Farm by George Orwell, and I picked up quite a few other George Orwell books. But yeah, this is just really great. And I really love this edition. It's beautiful. So stunning. The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde was a fantastical little play that I read. Sort of sparked my interest in Oscar Wilde, and I am now like a committed fan of him and his work. I read A Picture of Dorian Gray later in the year, but this still is just a hilarious little story that is just so strange and just over the top, and I love it. And I watched the film adaptation with Colin Firth, and Reese Witherspoon, and I still really liked it. I thought it was perfect. Colin Firth is just, you know, perfect. So, yeah. And this is just like a used paperback edition of the book that I found at a used bookstore. I think a sale at school or something like that. But, really liked it. He is great. The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherynne and Valente has to be probably one of my most favorite middle grade books ever. It's now sort of collecting a lot of interest in BookTube, and it's ending up in the hands of some really fantastic booktubers that I'm really excited for them to read. Like, for instance, Jessie the Reader got this for Christmas from somebody, I'm not sure who, and I'm super excited for them to read it because it is just like the most charming, whimsical, quirky story about a girl named September and all the little adventures she goes on. It's kind of like a mixture of Alice in Wonderland, The Chronicles of Narnia, and like all those really epic children's classic fantasy fairy tales all rolled up into this great, glorious book. And I highly recommend it. I've recommended it to quite a few people, and the people that I've recommended it to have adored it, and I think this is like the best book. I'm just gonna say this wins, hands down. So Neil Gaiman came out with a new book this year, and that was The Ocean at the End of the Lane. It is this really tiny little book, undoubtedly like top 5 favorite of this year. It's just an urban fantasy tale about a man who sort of recollects his past and how these sort of supernatural elements affected his life. And it's so great. It's everything Neil Gaiman is so great for, and I love it. It's beautiful. I can't even describe it. It's so fantastic. I don't even know if I did a complete review of this book. Maybe. I don't even know. But yeah, a lot of people have read it too and really enjoyed it. So read it. It's great. So I'm a big fan of Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki and his films. One of my favorite films of his is Howl's Moving Castle, and when I discovered that Howl's Moving Castle is actually the first book in a series by Diana Wynne Jones, I knew I had to pick it up, and I really fell in love with the story. It's a middle grade book, basically about a young girl who gets cursed by a witch and turned into an old woman, and she gets picked up by Howl, this very famous wizard that is supposed to be cruel and harsh, and he's not. I can't really go too much into detail about it, but it's very different from the movie. In the movie, there are a lot of elements in it that Miyazaki took from it, but sort of went his own way with it, and I highly respect it. In fact, the movie is still, I find, way better than the book, but the book is still incredibly charming. And I mean, if you don't watch any of Miyazaki's films, which is fine, but utterly unfortunate for you because they are fantastic, then pick up the book because it's still really great, and I love it, really love it. So yeah, that's one of those favorites of this year. Another one of my favorites for this year was Lullabies for Little Criminals by Heather O'Neill. This is a really tragic book. It's also one of those books that I've had in my library for such a long time and just sort of put off. It is like a Governor General finalist, and it's one of those Canadian books that you're supposed to read, and I loved it. It was tragic, it was beautifully written, and I don't know anything else by Heather O'Neill, but I'm interested to see what else she has. But this is just a really great book. It takes place in Montreal, the gruesome part of Montreal, which I never knew existed, and just about prostitution and drugs and all that unfortunate stuff. But it's beautifully written, it's heart-wrenching, it makes you feel a lot of emotions, and I can handle it. But I read it and I loved it. So another graphic novel that I ended up reading, it is called Hark, a Vagrant by very famous webcomic artist Kate Beaton. It is like my absolute favorite graphic novel. If you are a history and literature buff, then you will appreciate Kate Beaton, because she just does everything in these comics so well, and it's just brilliant. I love them. I love the illustrations, I love the humor, I love all the historical and literary references. Laugh my face off. It's just fantastic. So yeah, I recommend it. And lastly, Norwegian Wood by Murakami was my first sort of delve into Murakami. There's suicide and just love and sadness, and it emotionally gripped me. It actually like made my insides hurt. It just moved me so much, and in a way that not a lot of books have done that. I've watched the movie and the movie was great, but it still doesn't do the book justice. And every word that I read, I couldn't deal with the emotions that I had with this book. Like the characters were so real, and they stayed with me that I couldn't read anything else for a very long time. So this is definitely a favorite of mine, and I highly recommend it. And I can't wait to read more of Murakami's work in the coming year. So yeah. So I hope you enjoyed my top 13 books of 2013. Yeah, there were quite a few books that I really loved. There were still a lot of other books that I didn't include in this list, but you can definitely check out my Goodreads to see my ratings and whatnot. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more. Comment, rate, and subscribe. Ta-ta!